You're going to love today's pattern. This is the Briarwood top by Cashmerette. This pattern offers a couple of views, giving you some length options, as well as the option to add a front faux drawstring. There are quite a few steps to putting this top together, but we're going to go through the entire process step by step, so you're sure to sew it with success. I hope you join me in sewing this beautiful and unique top. Let's get started. Place one of your side front pieces right sides together with the lower front piece matching the notches and pin in place. And then repeat for the opposite side front piece. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press the seams toward the center. Here is the wrong side of my upper front piece, and I've gone ahead and transferred my button markings from my pattern piece along the top edge. Before I sew my buttonholes, I'm going to fuse a scrap piece of interfacing directly on top of my transferred markings. Then I'll take it to my sewing machine and sew those buttonholes in place. And then I'll open up those buttonholes. Now along the bottom edge of this same upper front piece, we're going to sew gathering stitches from notch to notch. I'm going to use the longest stitch on my machine and leave thread tails at both ends so that I have threads to pull for gathering, and I'll sew with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we can place the upper front and lower front pieces right sides together, matching the notches and pin in place. Pull the basting stitches so that the center gathered area of the upper front fits the lower front piece. Once it fits and the gathers are distributed evenly, go ahead and pin in place. Sew this seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press the seam down toward the lower front. Place one of your side back pieces right sides together with your center back piece, matching the notches, and pin in place. And repeat to pin your remaining side back piece to the opposite side of the center back. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press the seams toward the center back, just as we did to attach the side front pieces to the lower front piece. Here is the bottom of one of my sleeves. To make the hemming of the sleeve a little bit easier, I'm going to hem it now before applying the elastic. There are a few ways you could do this. You could use the rolled hem foot to secure that hem in place. You can take it to your ironing board and press the raw edges to the wrong side by 1/8 of an inch, and then again by an additional 1/8 of an inch, and edge stitch along that inner fold to secure the hem. I'm just going to take both of the bottoms of my sleeves to my serger and finish the raw edge. And once those raw edges are finished, I'll take it to the ironing board and press the raw edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, and then I'll edge stitch close to those finishing stitches straight across the bottom hem, doing this for both sleeves. Using a tracing wheel and tracing paper, I've marked the elastic ruffle marking from my pattern piece onto the wrong side of the bottom of my sleeve, and I've done this for both sleeve pieces. And I've cut a piece of 1/2 inch elastic according to the measurement chart listed in the pattern instructions. Now I'll place the elastic along my marked line, and I'll pin them together at the center, as well as along both ends. Now using a zigzag stitch with a length of 3 millimeters and a width of 3 millimeters, we're going to start our stitching a 1/2 of an inch in from one end, stretching that elastic to sew from pin to pin, and ending our stitching a 1/2 of an inch away from the opposite end. Once the elastic is applied, trim both of the short edges of the elastic so that there's no elastic within those side seam allowances. Repeat all of these steps to elasticate the bottoms of both sleeves. Place one of your sleeves along its corresponding side of the upper front piece, matching the notches, and pin in place. Note that the sleeve will extend a 1/2 of an inch beyond the innermost notch. Sew this seam from the underarm edge to the innermost notch, backstitching to secure. Finish those seam allowances and press the seam toward the sleeve. And then repeat the same steps to apply the other sleeve to the other side of the front bodice. Here are both of my sleeve pieces right sides facing me, and here are both of my back arm size. I'm going to place my back bodice piece right sides together with each of its arm size and pin them in place, matching the notches. Now we can sew the sleeves to the back bodice with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges and press them toward the sleeve just as we did for the front piece. Place one shoulder facing piece and the front facing right sides together, matching the slanted edge, and pin in place. Repeat with your remaining shoulder facing on the opposite side of the front facing. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim those seam allowances in half and press the seams open. Now we can place the two free ends of our shoulder facing right sides together with the back facing and pin in place. Sew these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, trim those seams by half, and press the seams open. Now take your constructed facing piece to the ironing board and press all of the outer edges to the wrong side by 1/2 inch all the way around. Here is the center open area between my front and back bodice pieces and the sleeves, with the right side of the fabric facing me. Place your facing and the garment neckline right sides together and pin them in place all the way around. Now we'll sew around the entire facing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, pivoting at each corner. Then we can trim that facing seam allowance all the way around by about half. And then we'll clip into all 4 of those corners, clipping to the stitching line but not beyond. And then we can press all of those seam allowances toward the facing. Then we're going to understitch. We're going to flip the facing over its seam allowance and sew the facing to its seam allowance 1/8 inch away from the original seam. As you're understitching, your presser foot won't allow you to go to each corner, so just understitch as far as you can. Stop your stitching, then start a fresh set of stitching to understitch the next section of the facing, doing that all the way around. Now we can turn those facings to the inside of the garment and give the neckline a press all the way around. As you're pressing, make sure that you maintain the 1/2 inch that we pressed under previously. You're also going to pin that pressed facing all the way around. I pressed and pinned at the ironing board as it was easier to get it all done that way. And you can see on the inside of the garment, you'll have a nice clean finish with that 1/2 inch seam allowance pressed underneath the facing. Now we're going to sew that facing in place, edge stitching close to that inner fold, and we're going to sew each section of the facing separately so that we can leave a 1/2 inch gap in our stitching on either end of each piece of the facing so that we can insert our elastic later. Now place your front and back bodice pieces right sides together, as well as each of your sleeves. And we're going to pin the entire side seam. Note that we're pinning the entire side seam of the side that we do not wish to place the zipper in. Sew your seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. So now I have one side seam sewn, and the opposite side of the garment will be the side where we insert the invisible zipper. For both sides, we're going to finish those seam allowances separately. Place your ruffle pieces right sides together and pin one short edge. Sew this short end with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once it's sewn, trim it down to 1/4 inch. Press that seam open. Then we'll fold this ruffle piece in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and give that a press all the way across. Then with the ruffle piece still folded wrong sides together, we're going to finish the short ends together on both sides. Then using the longest stitch on your machine and leaving thread tails on both sides with about 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew basting stitches through both layers of the ruffle along the raw edge from one end all the way across to the opposite end. Now I'm going to open up the bottom of my bodice along the sewn side seam, with the right side of the fabric facing me. Place the raw edge of the ruffle and the raw edge of the bodice right sides together, matching the side seams, and pin in place. Also match the center front and the center back and pin in place, and match the finished edges on both sides. Now I'm going to pull the basting stitches starting on one end so that the ruffle fits the bodice from one finished end to the side seam. Once it fits together, pin in place. And then repeat to gather the other side of the ruffle. Sew the ruffle to the bodice from one side to the other with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then finish the raw edges. Now with the ruffle attached and oriented downward, with its seam allowance pressed up toward the bodice, at this point you can optionally choose to sew the ruffle seam allowance to the bottom of the bodice 1/4 inch above the original seam line, from one end all the way across to the opposite end. Open up your invisible zipper and take it to your iron to roll and open up those coils. With the zipper open, the zipper mechanism will be at the underarm seam, and the stop at the bottom of the free ends of the zipper should align with the bottom folded edge of your ruffle. Also align the edges of the zipper tape with the finished edge of the garment, and pin in place. Then we'll take that edge of the zipper that's extending beyond the fold and tuck it underneath itself so that it's resting between the fabric and the zipper, and pin that in place. Then using a zipper foot or an invisible zipper foot, sew this edge of the zipper in place from the bottom to as far as you can get to the top of the zipper. Now that that side is sewn, I'll close my zipper. Then I'll place the unsewn side of the zipper tape right sides together with the unsewn side of the bodice. Having the zipper closed will allow us to match our seams. Once again, align the edge of your zipper tape with the finished edge of the bodice and pin in place. Once I have that aligned, I'll open the zipper once again and tuck that loose tail of the zipper between the fabric and the zipper, just as we did on the other side, and pin it in place. Take it to your sewing machine, and once again, just as we did on the other side, sew close to those zipper teeth from the bottom to as far as your presser foot will allow you to get to the top of the zipper. Now both sides of our zipper are attached, and we can close the zipper and pin the remainder of the seam from where we stopped our stitching to the bottom of the sleeve. Now we're going to finish sewing this seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting from where our stitches ended for the zipper. And for the first few stitches, I'm still going to use my zipper foot so I can get my needle as close to where I stopped the stitching earlier as possible. Then I'll switch back to my regular zipper foot to complete the rest of the seam. Cut each of your elastic pieces for the neckline according to the chart listed in your pattern instructions. Place one shoulder and one front elastic at a right angle, overlapping the short ends, and pin in place. Take it to your sewing machine and zigzag stitch to secure. Here is my elastic casing at the top of my front bodice piece. Take the front elastic piece and attach a safety pin at one end, and draw it through the opening that we left earlier until it comes out the opposite opening. Once it's drawn through, I'll allow the short end of the elastic to extend beyond the opening by about 2 inches and pin in place. Then I'll attach the safety pin to the loose short end of the shoulder elastic and draw it through its corresponding shoulder casing from one end to the other. And I'll allow this short end of the elastic to extend beyond the opening by 2 inches and pin in place. Then attach your remaining shoulder elastic and the back elastic at a right angle, just as we did for the other pieces, and zigzag to secure. Then lace these pieces of elastic through their respective casings through the opposite back corner. Now at your 2 remaining corners, you'll have overlapping elastic. Overlap at a right angle just as we attached the other 2 ends earlier, and zigzag stitch to secure. Now with the elastic fully pulled to the inside of the casing, pin the corners in place so that we can sew closed to the openings in our stitching. Sewing from the right side of the garment following the original stitching line. Do this for all 4 corners. Now to make sure that the elastic doesn't move around within the casing, at each corner we're going to stitch in the ditch, placing our needle right into that corner seam and stitching back and forth to secure, doing that at each corner. Now to prepare the drawstring for the front of the garment, I've cut a 32-inch long strip of fabric, 2 inches wide from my main fabric. And I've also cut a piece of cord slightly longer than the fabric. I'm going to place my cord in the center of the fabric and fold the fabric right sides together so that the cord is close to that center fold. And with the cord lying at the center fold, stitch it in place. Now with that one end of the cord secured in place and the strap still folded right sides together, I'm going to use a zipper foot to sew along the long raw edge of the drawstring, sewing as close to the cord as possible from one end all the way across to the opposite end. Then we can trim our seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch. And then we can pull that cord to turn the drawstring right side out. Now I can cut the cord from the drawstring. We can thread the cord through the front bodice, through one buttonhole and out the other. Then you can finish the ends in your preferred method. I'm just going to tie them in knots. And now your top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you get notified when a new full-length video comes out. I'll see you in the next video.